Ok,
Perfect.
benissimo. Allora, ci
Good evening,
Very
everyone.
well.
Buonasera Paul,
Good
siamo
evening,
davvero
Paul.
molto
We're
emozionati e
so
molto onorati di
happy
averti
and
qui nel
honoured
gruppo
to
di
have you
lettura
here with us for
LGBT
the
di
LGBT
Milano.
Milan Book Club.
L'ultimo libro che abbiamo
The
letto
last
è
book we
Latte
read
Arcobaleno, che
was
è
Rainbow Milk,
stupendo,
which
ci
is
ha
a
letteralmente
great
stregato
book. It
e
really
l'obiettivo di
bewitched us.
questa
And the
serata
aim
è
of this
celebrare
conversation
con te
tonight is to
questo
celebrate
meraviglioso
with you this
romanzo
great
che abbiamo
novel of
amato
yours,
moltissimo
which we
e ti
loved so
ringraziamo di averlo
much, and we
scritto.
thank you for
Questa
writing
serata
it.
abbiamo
So
pensato di
today
rivolgerti 12
we're going to
domande
ask you 12
che hanno a che
questions
fare con
which are
12
related to 12
temi
different
che noi
topics
abbiamo individuato
we actually
rispetto al tuo
found
libro.
while reading the
Direi
book.
quindi di darci, se siamo d'accordo,
So
5
if you
minuti a
agree,
domanda in modo da poter
I'll
rispondere a
say we
tutti
take 5
i
minutes for
membri
each
del
question
gruppo
so
di
that we can
lettura.
give
Io
everyone an
mi limito
answer.
solo a fare una
So
velocissima e
I would
rapidissima
just like
premessa dicendo che il
to make
romanzo
a
è davvero
short introduction by
straordinario e
saying that the
ricchissimo,
novel
ha
is
tanti
great,
temi,
so
la
rich, it has
religione
so many
e
topics such as
l'impatto che la
religion
religione ha
and the
sulla
impact that religion
formazione e
has
sulla
on the
sformazione
formation and
dell'identità,
deformation of
la
the
prostituzione
identity of
maschile,
oneself, male
l'insopprimibile
prostitution,
desiderio di essere amati,
and the
l'uso
desire
di
to be
droghe, in
loved,
particolare nel
drugs
corso dei
used
rapporti
particularly
sessuali,
during sexual
l'HIV,
intercourse,
la
as well
musica,
as
la pittura, il
HIV,
teatro
music,
e anche
painting,
l'essere e
theatre,
lavorare
and
come
also
camerieri.
being a waiter,
Ma
working as a waiter.
affronteremo anche
But we're
dei
going
temi
to
che
tackle
sono molto
some other
interessanti, che
themes
sono
which are
quelli
quite
stilistici,
interesting. So in
relativi
terms of
allo stile
style,
del romanzo e
the
alla
writing style
struttura
of the
del
novel and the
romanzo. Tra
structure of the
l'altro,
novel
Paul,
itself. And
stasera tra noi c'è
moreover,
la tua
today,
bravissima
here
traduttrice
with us, we
italiana
have
che,
your
come vedremo
Italian
dopo,
translator,
ha fatto un
who
lavoro davvero
has
straordinario,
done a great
soprattutto in
job, an
tutto il libro,
extraordinary
ma in
job
particolare, come
throughout the book,
potrai
and
immaginare, nella prima
in
parte del
particular in the
romanzo,
first
che è
part, as
quella
you
che
might
forse
imagine,
era
which
più
is the
challenging,
one
diciamo,
which was a
per
little
un
bit more
autore.
challenging compared to the
E
rest of
anche
the
lei
book.
avrà una domanda da
And
farti.
she's going to have a
Quindi
question for you
io
today too.
procedo a dare
So I'd
ti
like
ringrazio,
to
diciamo, per aver
thank you
accettato il nostro
for
invito
accepting our
e per
invitation
evitare di
tonight.
perdere ulteriore
And
tempo do subito la
so, as
parola
not to
al tuo
waste any
primo
more time, I
lettore,
would give the
che si
floor
chiama
to
Matteo,
the
è molto
first
giovane
reader. His
e
name
che
is Matteo.
farà
He's
la
very young,
domanda in sostituzione
and he's going
dell'interprete
to ask this question on behalf of
dall'inglese all'italiano, in
Massimiliano, who's the
sostituzione di
interpreter from
Massimiliano. Questa è la
English
domanda di
into
Massimiliano, ma lui
Italian.
sta
So this question was
interpretando
originally
e
from
quindi ovviamente non la
Massimiliano,
può
but
fare.
he's
E allora
translating, of course, so
interviene
he
Matteo.
can't ask
Matteo,
it
vai.
himself. So Matteo, the floor is yours.
Sì, buonasera.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone.
Ovviamente sono molto contento
Of
di
course, I'm
avere
so
l'autore a cui posso appunto
happy
fare
to
questa
to
domanda.
have Paul with
No,
us and to have the
ovviamente
opportunity
anche se
to
in
ask this
sostituzione di
question, even if
Massimiliano.
it is on
Parto
behalf
subito
of
così non perdiamo
Massimiliano. So
ulteriore
I would
tempo.
like to
E
start
volevo
briefly so as
appunto
not to waste any
chiedere
more time. So I
quanto
wanted to ask you
di
how
Paul
much of
Mendez
Paul
c'è
Mendez
nella storia di Jesse,
Paul Mendez' story is
soprattutto
there
se
in
qualora ci
Jesse's
fossero
story, and
qualora ci siano tante sovrapposizioni come
if the two
sembra,
stories
perché
do
non hai
overlap
scelto
at
di
times,
chiamare
how come you
effettivamente il tuo
didn't choose to give
protagonista
your
Paul
protagonist the
Mendez?
name of Paul
E
Mendez and not Jesse?
mi attacco e mi aggancio
And
chiedendoti
speaking of
infine,
this,
applicheresti
my last
eventualmente
question
il
is,
termine
would you
autofiction a
refer to
questa
your
tua
work
opera, a questo
as
tuo romanzo?
autofiction, maybe?
Grazie.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to be interviewed this evening. It's great to see so many of you. And thank you for the kind words at the top. It's very much appreciated. Italy is the first non-English territory to accept rainbow milk, Latte Arcobaleno. And in translation, and you are the first non-English group to invite me to speak. So this is slightly overwhelming, I have to say. But yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. So thank you very much for the question, Massimiliano. Rainbow Milk is a work of fiction, full stop. There are aspects of my life that I've donated to the novel, and Jesse and I have a lot in common in terms of both growing up as Jehovah's Witnesses, both growing up in the Black Country region in the West Midlands of England, both being descendants of the Windrush generation, both being gay. We are the same age, etc. We have a lot of differences as well, however, and Jesse has a white stepfather, for instance. I don't. My dad is Black and he's married to my mother. Jesse was disfellowshipped from the Organization of Jehovah's Witnesses in a very different way from me. Jesse moved to London a long time before I did. Every character Jesse encounters is a work of fiction by me. Every space in which he enters is a work of fiction by me. That's not to say that I don't know the same places or know people who are vaguely similar. That's not to say that I've not been through similar situations, because I have, but a long time ago. I'm 39 years old. I was writing this at the age of 37. Jesse is 19, going on 20. You know, I kept journals, but I don't remember a lot of what I went through. I just have the scars. So for me, yes, it is based on what you could say is memoiristic material, but I've used craft all the way through the novel to create a story that is about someone called Jess. That's why I wrote it in third person. Until very late on in the process, I was writing in first person, and I found it a great struggle to maintain a truthful authorial voice that was my own, because I was still writing about someone who was very similar to me and going through some of the things that I went through. However much I tried to fictionalize them, it was as if I was opening my own wounds. So switching to third person was a great help in terms of distinguishing me as an author in my late 30s with all of my experience and my education and knowledge, and applying that to telling the story of a 19-year-old, very naive, sheltered former Jehovah's Witness who does not know what he's doing when he jumps headfirst into his queer reality. And the character of Graham, Jesse's stepfather, he arrived at that point in the process, and he completely changed the story because it became as much about Jesse reckoning with himself as the product of expectations placed on him as a Black person that he's not aware of because he's been raised by a white man, as it is about him just sort of facing the world and trying to decide who he is and what he's supposed to be doing. And then also the character of Norman, who opens the book in 1959, is based on the very few scraps of information I know of my paternal grandfather, who died when my dad was 2. So there's very little, he's never spoken about, there's very little known of him. And I used what I knew and created a fictional space around him. And so the novel itself becomes a sort of a dialogue between Norman and Jesse, 50 years apart, and between them, inadvertently, they create the lost generation in the middle who, again, wasn't able to tell his own story. So it becomes a generational saga in which the third generation is able to reflect back on his heritage once he feels that he has the privilege to do so, and rehabilitate those who came before who weren't able to tell their own stories. There is very little of me personally in Jesse, but all authors go inside themselves when they're stuck. And they look for their own experiences. They look for people who they've known in the past. They look for houses they've been in. They look for art galleries they've been to, music they've listened to. Music is an incredible anchor to memory. You know, you can hear a song that you've not heard for 20 years and it will posit you straight back in that time and in the self that you were at that time. And it's an incredible way of just being able to explore a moment in time. You know, all pop songs are little time capsules, if you like, as are fashion magazines, etc. So they were all part of my process. And I think the final part of the question was, or one of the parts of the question was, why would I call this autofiction? No, I call it fiction. It's a novel. And I always use the example of the work of my partner, Alan Hollinghurst, who, you know, grew up in a middle class English environment, went to prep school, was privately educated, went to Oxford University, studied English, is a Henry James fanatic. And he writes about those kinds of characters, and yet nobody asks him whether it's fiction or not. So, you know, we both use craft in our own way, but we write about the things that that we are, you know, that we have front row seats to the experience of. I can put it that way, because only we can tell those kinds of stories. So it's fiction.
Grazie mille Paul,
Thank
mi
you
viene
very
in mente
much, Paul.
quello
And
che diceva
thinking about what
Flaubert quando parlava di Madame Bovary, che
Robert
diceva
when
Madame Bovary
Flaubert
c'est moi,
talking about
in
Madame
qualche
Bovary
modo è
said,
questo il senso forse
Madame Bovary
della scrittura,
feels like
e tra l'altro
something
hai poi
similar. So
accennato il
maybe
tema
this is the feeling
della
of
musica
writing,
di
and
cui
you
parleremo
talked
più
about
avanti
the
perché
theme
c'è
of
anche
music, and
musica
we're
nel
going to
libro.
talk about the
Ti
theme of
faccio
music
io
later on,
la
because there's a
domanda
lot of
che
music
avevo per te
in the book.
e
I'm
che
going to
riguarda il
ask the
tema della
next question,
religione.
and
Ci
this is
sono in
about
particolare
religion.
due passaggi
In
che
particular, there
descrivono
are
molto
two
bene nel
episodes
libro
in the book
l'importanza della
describing the
Bibbia per i
importance
testimoni di
of the
Geova.
Bible for Jehovah's
Il primo
Witnesses.
in cui
The first
Jesse,
one
poco prima
is
di andare a
the one where
casa,
Jesse, before
sceglie
leaving
che
home,
cosa portare con sé e
decides what
decide
he's
di
going to
non
take with him,
prendere
and he
la
chooses
sua copia della
not to
Bibbia, dato
take
che
his copy of the
incarna
Bible
un
since
giudizio negativo
it embodies a negative
su di sé, sulla
judgment
propria
of his own
natura.
nature.
E più avanti c'è invece
And later on,
un
the second
dialogo in
one
cui Owen
is
dice che
the
Jesse è
dialogue
stato molto
with
fortunato
Owen, where
a poter
Jesse
studiare. Owen
says
dice a Jesse che è stato molto
Owen
fortunato a
tells
studiare la
Jesse
Bibbia
he was very
perché la Bibbia è
lucky
la
to
più
have
grande opera
had the opportunity to
letteraria
study
che
the
il mondo
Bible
abbia
because
mai
it is the
conosciuto.
greatest
Mentre
literary work
Jesse
the world has
risponde
ever
che la
known.
Bibbia non ha fatto
Well,
altro che
Jesse replies that
istruirlo
the Bible
per
has done nothing
giudicarlo.
but
A
educate
questo
him
punto
in order to
emerge dal
judge
tuo
him.
libro che
And
ciò
at
che
this point,
caratterizza la
your book
religione,
presents to us
perlomeno così
what
come vissuta
religion is
dai testimoni di
characterized
Geova,
by,
sono due
as in the
aspetti.
way it is lived by
Uno
Jehovah's
è
Witnesses,
l'estrema
which are
precarietà di
two
questa
aspects.
vita,
The first
che
one is the
distorce la
extreme
proiezione sul
precariousness
futuro
of
a
life,
lungo
which
termine,
is just our
visto che
long-term
per i testimoni
projections
di
on the
Geova
future, given the
è
fact that
sempre
for Jehovah's
imminente la fine
Witnesses,
di questo
the
sistema
end
che è
of the
governato
system
dal
governed
nemico di
by the
Dio.
enemies
E
of
quindi
God
si vive
is
aspettando il
forthcoming.
momento in cui ci
And we
sarà la
live waiting
devastazione
for
finale e
Armageddon,
interrogandosi sul fatto
wondering
se
if
sia o no
the
arrivata, ad
end
esempio
has
quando
really
crollano le
come
torri
or
gemelli.
not, as for
E
instance
due,
in the
c'è un
9/11
altro tratto,
episode.
è la dimensione
And another
giudicante
aspect
della
is
Bibbia.
the
La Bibbia è vissuta in
judgmental
modo
dimension of the
totalizzante,
Bible.
assorbente,
The
deve dare
Bible,
risposta
which
a
is
tutto,
experienced in an
ma soprattutto dà
all-embracing way,
giudizi
it must
severi e
provide the
negativi su
answers to
tutto. A
everything,
questo
and above
punto
all,
quello che
it
ci siamo
passes some
chiesti è
serious and negative
quanto
judgments
è
in everything.
difficile
So at this
liberarsi
point, what we
da
wondered
queste due
was, how
prospettive. La
difficult is
prima,
it
il senso
to
di
free yourself
precarietà
from
della
these two
vita e la
perspectives?
seconda,
So
il
the feeling
giudizio
of
negativo
precariousness in
su se
life and the
stessi.
negative judgments
Ce
of
ne si
oneself.
libera fino in fondo di
Can
queste
one
due
free
prospettive
themselves
o
all the way
residua
through, or
sempre
will there always
qualcosa, c'è
be
un
a
residuo che
residue of
rimane
it
dentro
in the back of
di
our
noi?
minds?
Ed è vero che la
And
libertà
is
che
it
noi ci
true that
guadagniamo
the
comporta
freedom we
sempre, anche la
earn
libertà
always
dalla religione,
entails
un senso di
inevitably a
perdita
sense of
e un senso di
loss
abbandono,
and
in particolare un
abandonment,
abbandono
and
della
more
parte di sé?
specifically, an abandonment of
Grazie.
ourselves and a piece of ourselves? Thank you.
Do you know what? I'll just say that I was on Instagram yesterday and a friend of mine posted, he lives up in Glasgow, posted a picture of a handwritten letter. And it was written in handwriting I immediately recognize as that of a Jamaican woman. And I don't know why, but it just, you know, it looked like my grandmother's handwriting. Both my grandmothers have this kind of very spidery handwriting. And I kind of thought, well, you know, that's a Jamaican woman who's written that. And the return address was for a Kingdom Hall. So immediately I sort of froze up. And the letter read something along the lines of, I just want to introduce you to a scripture, Isaiah something. And, you know, if you enjoyed reading this scripture, then I would like to call at your house and have a conversation with you about it. Yours sincerely, da da da. And I commented, that's so triggering. It really was very triggering to me to see this handwritten letter. So I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, and until the age of 17, I very devoutly and very sort of confidently, devotedly preached from door to door every Saturday, every Sunday, during the school holidays, probably 5-6 days a week. I'd be out there knocking on doors with my big sort of bag full of magazines and brochures, preaching to people at their door. But that was, again, over 20 years ago. It's been 20 years since, or more than 20 years since I was disfellowshipped, and I've tried everything to leave it behind. But still, when I see this handwritten letter, because of the data sort of control thing, I can't remember what it's called, GCHQ, no, ignore me, but they're not allowed to call at people's door and take their details anymore. So they're finding all kinds of new ways to be able to find people and preach to them. And it just kind of made me think, you can't escape from you can't escape, they don't let you. I have a very close friend who is a similar age to me, and is similarly departed for a similar length of time, so over 20 years since he's been a Jehovah's Witness. And one of the elders from his former congregation called him, like no sort of preparatory text or anything, just called him on his mobile and said, hi, I'm one of the elders from your former congregation. I'm just calling to see how you are spiritually and whether you might want to come back to the organization. And this is 20 years. And this is someone who's been through suicidal tendencies, you know, someone who has, because of the way that the religion has imposed itself upon him through his life, as a queer mixed race man who is very conflicted about gender, about sexuality, about all the things that he wants for himself, but that he was taught are evil and that he will die at Armageddon for. You know, he's tried to bury those things and embrace the person that he really is. And yet still 20 years later, he's got this elder down his ear saying, you know, oh, do you want to come back? Because, you know, you're clearly just lost. It's absolutely horrible. It's so abusive. And it's just incredibly difficult to get away from. And I don't know another organization, I don't know another religious community that does that to people, really. And, you know, I mean, for me personally, having left the organization, it took me a long time to stop preaching. You know, I was, you know, having full gay sex and being, you know, doing whatever I could do to not be that person anymore. But then as soon as anyone asked me a question about anything metaphysical, I would retreat straight back into my taught beliefs based on the Bible, because that's all I knew. That was the foundation for everything. So creation, you know, I was anti-feminist. I didn't believe in abortion. I was actually homophobic, actually, you know, that's how bad it was. I was living the life that I thought that I wanted to live, but nobody else was allowed to do that. That was bad. You know, I didn't want to see gay men or women walking down the road holding hands. Like, that was wrong, you know. And it took me a long time to get over that. You know, perhaps I'm still not over all of it. I don't know. Don't get me wrong, like, I'm pro-choice and I'm a feminist or feminist adjacent, and, you know, I love my queer people and I want them to be who they are. But there's still sort of there's a scripture in the Bible that says, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, give me the child and I'll give you the man. I'm sure it's Jesus who said that. And that's exactly, what happened to me, being brainwashed from a very early age. I was giving Bible readings to the congregation from the age of 9, and, really sort of made it my own and took it on for myself. And when that is your when that's your education, your base education, it's incredibly difficult to let that go. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into the bitterness that Jessie has, really. And that's very early on, still in Jessie's sort of coming of age story, if you like. So yeah, there's a lot of self-abuse that he goes through in order to basically break out of the body that he that is steeped in this doctrine. And I've been through that too, and I've been through an extra 15-20 years of that, to what we see Jessie going through at that point with Owen. And it's never easy. There are always triggering moments, such as the one I mentioned at the top on Instagram, so which make you realize still how much it's part of your psyche. I hope that answers your question. I went on for a long time.
Assolutamente sì, la domanda riguardava proprio quanto quello che noi abbiamo assorbito e che si assorbe da una religione durante l'infanzia, la precarietà, il senso di precarietà della vita, il giudizio su noi ci attacchi anche quando siamo adulti e pensiamo di essercene liberati. Passo alla terza domanda, grazie mille Paul per questa risposta così bella, così circostanziata. E la terza domanda te la fa Gianluca, che ci parlerà della maternità nel libro.
Buonasera Paul. Sì, vorrei parlare della madre. Del personaggio della madre che ci è sembrato molto complesso. Una madre violenta, anaffettiva, che odia il figlio. E quindi ci siamo un po' interrogati sui motivi di questo odio e abbiamo anche provato a darci delle risposte. Forse la madre odia Jessie perché è frutto di una gravidanza indesiderata, forse perché lei è figlia di una coppia mista e magari consciamente o inconsciamente rinnega la parte nera di sé che è esteriorizzata dal figlio di colore. Oppure un'altra ragione è che lei odiava il fatto che man mano che Jessie cresceva, in tutte le cose che faceva si rivelava sempre migliore di lei. Un'ultima ipotesi che abbiamo fatto è perché rivede nel figlio il compagno che era gay e quindi le suscita in qualche modo repulsione o risentimento per l'abbandono subito. E quindi volevamo chiederti se ti ritrovi in queste motivazioni che ci siamo dati, oppure ce ne sono delle altre che vuoi illustrarci. Grazie.
Thank you, Gianluca. Absolutely, all of those things. I think I picked up in your analysis the assumption that Jess's mother was biracial herself, if I'm correct. She's not, she's Black. She's fully Black. And so there is a little bit of, well, a lot of internalized racism there. The way she looks at herself in the mirror, she's looking at a Black face. Everyone is looking at a Black face when they see her, but she believes that she's white, because whiteness is a concept. Nobody in the world is white. White has been created by white supremacy, by colonial powers, to say this is what is acceptable in the world, this is who runs the world, this is what you should all aspire to be, and she is being of a generation previous to Jessie, is less armed against that. So, and less she has less strength to be able to hold herself together. So I really feel that, so I'm, you know, third generation Jamaican British. My parents are second generation. My grandparents are first generation. Before them, there's nothing. There are a few Black people living here before the Windrush generation, but not a community. There weren't numbers, you know, there weren't families and communities and estates, etc. So when my grandparents came, it was to a completely new world. They were educated to believe that Britain was, you know, the mother country, and, you know, post World War II, invite all of the Black and brown people from the former colonies to come and help the post-war effort and turn Britain into the great power that it once was. And they sort of really had faith that they would come here and be welcomed. And they found exactly the opposite to that which they expected. And so it was a real struggle and a real sense of shame. And my grandparents, 3 of whom are now dead, or all of whom came from Jamaica, none of them will talk about the early days because it's such a shame to them. And it was so hard. And that was the environment that they brought their kids into. So my mother and all of her siblings, my dad and all of his siblings were all born here in the 50s and 60s. And they were the firstborn children who had to sort of grow up amongst a racist environment as minorities. And I really believe that that generation is profoundly damaged by stop and search and, you know, the prevailing fascist environment that they grew up in. So where I grew up in the Black Country, just outside Birmingham, that was the center of neo-fascism. So my borough was next to the one that Enoch Powell was the MP for. And of course, he made the famous, infamous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, which sort of swept up so much more anti-immigrant and fascist sentiment. And, you know, my parents back in 1968, my dad was 12, my mum was 7. And that's the environment that they had to go to school every day in. So I grew up a generation later. I was born in 1982. And I got called a nigger every day at school by someone, you know, at primary school. You know, so if I went through that 20 years later, can you imagine what my parents went through, you know? As children, we don't realize that when we were growing up. You know, we don't realize why our parents behave the way they do. We're like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, just, you know, trying to sort of understand everything. And we just don't understand what happened before us. We don't understand what happened before we were born. We don't understand that sometimes we were mistakes, you know, and that our parents are trying their best to deal with these mistakes, but still we're right there day after day after day to be dealt with, you know? So that's why, you know, I'm not going to say that Val is my mother, but I've certainly written a character that who portrays the same kind of atmosphere, the same kind of persona. And I've not shied away from presenting that character truthfully, but at the same time, I've tried to be forgiving and to show that, you know, there's no such thing as, you know, good and evil. You know, there's a whole spectrum in between. And that, you know, some people behave in certain ways that they're not aware of. You know, poor Black people don't get therapy. Poor Black people don't necessarily get the education. You know, they just live their lives and they're not necessarily aware of the way they treat other people, certainly their children. So all of the things that you identified, Gianluca, are all true. You know, the sense that she hates him because he's the son of a gay man and she's moved away from the person who had a child with a gay man, and now she's married a white Jehovah's Witness, and she has 3 light-skinned, beautiful girls who had really soft curly hair that she can sort of plait, you know, and that's wonderful for her. But she then looks upon Jessie as someone who represents the person who she was before she found God. And, you know, while Jessie questions whether she really believes in God or not, that's, you know, besides the point when it comes to the way that she treats him. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting kind of dynamic. But I thought that it was very important that I sort of present her in a balanced way and presented her in a forgiving way and acknowledged her position as part of a generation of people who are very damaged by their identity as Black British people and as pioneers. Some people were much stronger, but certainly Val wasn't.
Grazie mille Paul,
Thank you very
secondo
much,
me
Paul.
il personaggio della
In my
madre
opinion,
è
the character of Jess's mother
meraviglioso
is
proprio perché lo
amazing,
hai rappresentato nella sua
because it is
struggente umanità
represented in
e perché
all its
appunto
humane
racconta un tema
aspects
secondo
of
me
humanity, and
molto
it
molto
tells
bello,
that
molto interessante, che è
topic
quello del
which is
razzismo
quite
appunto
interesting, which is
interiorizzato.
interior
Passo perché abbiamo
racism.
ancora ben 8
So I'm
domande,
giving the
quindi
floor to someone else because
vado
we still
veloce
have 8 questions.
verso
I'm trying to speed up a little
Gianluca,
bit.
un
So
altro Gianluca, si chiama
Gianluca,
anche
another
lui Gianluca,
Gianluca.
ne abbiamo 3 nel gruppo,
We have 3
che ti
Gianlucas
fa
actually in the group,
una
and
domanda
it's going to
sulla
ask you a
sessualità
question about
nel
sexuality
libro.
in the
Grazie.
novel. Thank you.
Ciao Paul,
Hello,
veramente
Paul.
un vero piacere
It's a
conoscerti, ho
great
amato molto
pleasure
il
to
tuo
meet you.
libro. Ciao.
I really loved your book.
Sì, allora, il sesso è una
So,
delle tematiche centrali
sex is
del
one
tuo
of the
romanzo,
central theme in your
e
novel,
viene trattato con estrema
and it is
schiettezza ed
coupled
estrema
with
onestà,
extreme honesty and
affrontato anche
frankness
attraverso
from
numerose prospettive.
many different
Vengono
perspectives.
esplorati aspetti inusuali del
So there were
sesso a
some
pagamento,
unusual
come la
aspects of
cura
paid sex
e
which are
l'affetto
tackled in the
reciproco,
novel,
che
such
però
as
si
mutual
contrappone
caring and affection,
alla violenza e ai
as opposed
rischi e
to
l'uso della
violence
persona
and risks
per far correre
on the
dei
use of
rischi. Per
the
esempio,
person.
ci è
For
rimasto molto
example,
impresso, ci ha colpito
we're really touched
l'episodio in cui un cliente
by the episode where a
cerca
client
di coinvolgere
tries
Jessie nella
to involve
restituzione
Jesse
di un
in
gioiello e
giving
quindi
back a piece
fargli
of
correre
jewelry
un
in order
rischio al
to
posto suo.
charge him the
Oppure
risk
l'episodio in
of the
cui
theft on his
un
behalf.
cliente
But
provoca
also
una
the episodes
lacerazione
where
anale
a
molto
client
importante
tears
in Jessie, tanto che
Jesse's
Jessie rimane
harness,
destabilizzato e
so
quasi
much so
pensa
that
di
he's so
abbandonare
overwhelmed by
la
it,
professione
and
della
thinks about,
prostituzione.
leaving
Viene
his
affrontato il
job
tema del
as an
feticismo
escort.
nei
But
confronti
also, we
del
find the theme of
corpo
sexual
nero, in
fetish towards
quanto
the
corpo
black
di
body
un ragazzo
of the
nero all'interno
protagonist, which is
del
then
romanzo, collegato all'ipersessualità,
associated
collegato
to
ad una concezione
hypersexuality
del
and
sesso
to some kind of
animale, l'animalità del rapporto
animality,
sessuale.
some
Viene
animal
affrontato
conception
anche
of
il tema
sex.
dell'uso di
But we
droghe,
also find the theme of
chemsex,
drug use,
e viene
chemsex,
affrontato anche il tema
during
delle malattie
intercourse,
sessualmente
and also
trasmissibili.
the
Una su
theme of
tutte, ovviamente, quella che
STDs,
fa un po' da protagonista
which
è
is quite
l'HIV. La
where
cosa
HIV's the
la cosa che ci è
protagonist,
apparsa molto
let's say.
interessante della tua
So
trasposizione del
the most
sesso e
interesting
della
aspect
professione del
we
sesso
found
è quella
about
che sembra
the
una totale
sexual
mancanza di
profession
giudizio.
is
Tant'è
the
vero
lack
che
of
viene
judgment,
definita
so the lack
proprio
of a judgmental perspective on
professione
paid sex.
della
In fact, it
prostituzione come
is
se fosse un
considered
lavoro qualunque, quindi viene tolta una sorta di
just
giudizio
as any kind
morale
of job.
moralista.
So there's
E
no
addirittura il
moral
bilancio sembra
judgment
essere
referred to
positivo
it.
per il
And
protagonista, in
even
quanto
more than
i
that,
rapporti
like in
sessuali
the
sembrano
end,
quasi essere una
it
forma
seems
di
to be on,
ricerca
like the
di
balance
se
seems to be on
stesso,
the positive
funzionale alla
side,
ricerca di se
and the
stesso.
character is,
La
and
domanda
it is
è
essential
davvero
for the character
così
to find
la
himself.
lettura che volevi
So
dare
is
di questo rapporto
this
sessuale,
really,
il
the
messaggio che volevi
interpretation you wanted to
trasmettere?
give,
E
the
poi
message
un'altra
you wanted to
domanda,
communicate?
forse più
And
una tua opinione al
another
riguardo,
question,
rispetto al modo in cui tu
which is more like an opinion of
descrivi la
yours.
sessualità
So,
maschile e la prostituzione
as
maschile
you describe
all'interno del tuo
male
romanzo, c'è
prostitution
una
in the
differenza o
novel,
volevi far emergere
is
una
there any
differenza
difference, or
tra
did you
la
want to
prostituzione
communicate any
maschile
difference
e la
between
prostituzione femminile?
female and male
Grazie.
prostitution? Thank you.
Thank you, Gianluca. I'll deal with the second part of the question first because it's easiest. I don't know anything really about female prostitution. I've written a male character who happens to do sex work, and he decides that he can do sex work because as a man, he has the male privilege of being in control. And, you know, he feels that as a young, sort of relatively strong Black man, he is not going to be in danger. And I know that's a very naive thing to say. But as a man, he's in control. You know, as the active, as a top, he is in control, literally. So he feels like it's very unlikely that he's going to be vulnerable to an assault or anything like that. And that's, of course, naive, because that's exactly what happens to him. But I don't have really anything to add to that in terms of female prostitution, because it's just such a complex environment. You know, you have sex trafficking involved, you have, you know, there are probably as many young female prostitutes who, like Jessie, are very much in control of what they're doing, as there are women who are coerced and who are forced to participate in the sex trafficking industry, which, as we know, is a multi-million capitalist vehicle. So I was very careful not to include other aspects of sex work and just make this very much about Jesse's own story and his reasons for doing sex work. You know, it's an unregulated system. Anyone can do it whenever they want. And, you know, we saw that during the pandemic. You know, we saw so many people starting OnlyFans pages, etc., to help pay the rent, because, you know, when everything else is gone, your body is the last thing that you've got. So that was simply Jesse's way of being able to fulfill a couple of things, and that was to have all the sex in the world that he wanted with men he found, get paid for it, and sort of therefore help him settle in London, but also to do something almost illegal, but not quite, that would, but certainly completely anathema as far as his religious doctrine is concerned, to break free of it, you know, to help him, to shock himself into thinking for himself and not thinking simply about scripture. And that's why Jesse, sort of, that's how Jesse justifies going into prostitution. And so I'm glad you think that there was no sort of moral judgment in my choice of, in my way of delineating Jesse's story. I don't think I have anything to say about that really, except that, like I was saying earlier, it's taken me a long time to become less judgmental about a lot of things. And that's just a reflection, I suppose, of, or the way I've treated Jesse's character as a prostitute who just happens to be a prostitute, as, you know, that's his job. That is a function of it just shows how far I've come away from the doctrine, I suppose, as a person. I've tried my best to reflect a lot of the experiences that I went through as a sex worker, without sort of being absolutely literal about them. So, you know, there was no Rufus in my life, but there was someone 15 years later who I met in a nightclub, who I didn't have sex with, but we became friends. He was like a person on the South London gay scene. And one day he called me to say that he'd been suspended from his job because he'd gone home with a piece of jewelry. And because I'd known him for a few years and could call him a friend, I thought, oh, well, of course I'll do that for you. And then something in my head just went, there's going to be like 10 police cars there immediately if I'm there with a piece of stolen jewelry. And so I called a mutual friend of ours, and he was just like, that doesn't sound legit. So I just had to kind of call the guy back and be like, I'm really sorry, but no. And so I used that and combined it with, I guess, the character of a client, to show, I guess, the precariousness of Jesse's position as someone who's new and naive and beautiful and can be picked up, but actually he can be picked up by people who don't have his best interests at heart. And so as readers, we're very much invested in Jesse as a character. We want the best for him. And so when we see people like that around, it kind of helps us to see what the intersectional things that Jesse has to deal with are, in terms of being both kind of desired as a Black male figure, but also potentially criminalized and easy to take advantage of. And then just very briefly on sex, I just wanted to write the sort of sex that that is queer, that is gay, that isn't for straight people to judge. You know, we don't see very often anywhere queer sex, especially not involving young queer Black men, and especially not in an intergenerational, interracial setup. And so I wanted to be absolutely clear with the sex scenes and to show exactly what's happening. You know, I'm not a white man. I'm not a cisgender straight white man writing about having sex with, you know, a 20-year-old blonde girl, because we all know what that looks like. So, you know, I just wanted to show what it looks like and show what it smells like. And certainly coming from Jesse's perspective of, you know, I've had this fantasy in my head my whole life, but, you know, this is my first opportunity to actually sort of, you know, make that a reality. You know, I really wanted to show how he experiences it. And yeah, hopefully that came across. Thank you, Gianluca.
È stato facile ed è stato molto importante, molto interessante, molto originale, e quindi è stato molto bello. Vado veloce perché abbiamo ancora ben 6 domande. E poi, Paul, se dovrai andare, non ti preoccupare, diciamo che anche se non riusciamo a farle tutte, valuta tu, nel senso che noi non vogliamo rapirti via Zoom. Spero che comunque riusciamo a farne una buona parte. La prossima domanda è di Andrea.
So next question is from Andrea.
Io volevo chiederti un po' sull'aspetto
storico
del romanzo, perché ho notato che hai scelto 3 momenti molto importanti nella storia dello UK, delle race relations in particolare, perché lo ricordo alla fine degli anni 50, quindi il periodo della Windrush Generation e l'abolizione dei Teddy Boys, poi c'è stato il momento post 11 settembre e poi il periodo del referendum su Brexit. E io quindi mi stavo chiedendo come mai hai scelto questi 3 momenti? Semplicemente è capitato che le storie dei personaggi accadevano in questi 3 momenti così anche traumatici, o hai voluto tu scegliere questi periodi per fare anche un commentario storico?
To tackle some historic aspect of any sort?
Well, thank you for your question, Andrea. The structure of the novel happened quite accidentally. So the reason for me to write Rainbow Milk was always to create a fiction based on my personal trajectory from leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses and becoming a sex worker. That took place over a period of 5 years between the end of the 90s and the sort of around 2004 or 5. But in being challenged to sort of create a fiction, I started to look at world events and how they impacted me, and therefore how they could impact Jessie. So I got my book deal. I received a 2-book deal from my UK publisher in November 2017. And 1 month later, the Windrush scandal broke in the press, in the UK press. So, brief summary, the children of the Windrush generation, so kids who were brought here on their parents' passports in the 1960s and 70s, were asked to prove that they'd lived here and paid taxes every year of that time. And sometimes it can be up to 50 years. And they were asked to like produce receipts, you know, from like 1972. And their landing cards had been destroyed back in 2014. So it was a real scandal that the government had destroyed the evidence and then asked the people on the ground to prove their existence. And I realized that, you know, my grandparents who'd come here in the 1950s all left children in Jamaica to move here. They all left Jamaica with the idea that, you know, we'll send for our children when we are settled. And they believed, obviously, that they would be settled eventually, otherwise they wouldn't have left their children. But of course, as we've already mentioned, life was not what they expected it to be when they got here. My grandparents on my mother's side lived in a shared house with 4 other couples until they had 4 children, and that's the only time that the council would give them a house. So it was very, very difficult circumstances and actually impossible for them to send for their children. And so I have an aunt who is my mum's big sister, who my mum has met once and now lives in New York. And my mum also had an older brother who was also left in Jamaica, but he died in the 80s. So, but if they'd been sent for and lived here, they would have been asked to prove their existence. So I was just thinking a lot about my family and the Windrush scandal at the time. And as I said earlier, I was thinking a lot about my paternal grandfather, who came to the UK in 1956, fit and healthy, but very soon after moving here, started to develop migraine headaches and blurred vision, and eventually went blind. And when my grandmother, his wife, took him to the doctor said, "It's because you're so tall and the sun is very different here than it is down in the tropics." And, you know, if that's not what's the word? If that's not institutionalized racism in the medical industry, I don't know what is. He died. My grandmother couldn't look after him and their 2 children and work the 2 jobs that she needed to replace his salary, or his income. So it ruined my family, that event. So I was thinking a lot about that when the Windrush scandal broke. I didn't even know that the Windrush generation was called the Windrush generation until the Windrush scandal broke. I didn't know that my grandparents were part of that. I didn't know about the history because you don't get taught that history at school in Britain. Even Black History Month, it's all very kind of samey, and let's just celebrate the few Black British people who've managed to get knighted or whatever. You know, and I think sadly George Floyd's death has come along and changed that, and made it much more pertinent a question in terms of Britain reckoning with its colonial past, and giving Black British people a space in which to have these conversations about our past. And maybe it's not even giving us a space, maybe it's us taking that space. But yeah, I was just very kind of aware of that, and I'd done some acting. I played Othello and decided to create the character of Norman physically. in terms of thinking about what my grandfather's life must have been like, being, you know, in his early 30s with 2 small children, a very tall, very large man, blind, worried about trampling on his children, thinking, what the hell have I done moving here, taking them away from Jamaica to this racist country. Then I chose 9/11 as a moment for Jesse to have, I mean, this is where, this is probably the most fictional part of the novel in some ways, because my experience of 9/11 was very different. I was at my grandparents' house with my 3 young cousins when the TV soap opera that we were watching was interrupted by the news to show us what was happening on 9/11. So my experience is very sort of dull in comparison to Jesse's. But I just sort of saw a way of Jesse being presented with a world event that almost mimicked his expectation of Armageddon. And that would sort of present him with 2 options: either you stay and carry on with your beliefs, or you go. And he obviously witnesses 9/11 in the company of a gay couple, and that's the first time he's ever sort of been in the company of 2 men who have sex with men. And so it's a doubly mind-blowing sort of situation for him that sort of presents him with options in life. And you know, Jesse's disfellowshipping for the crime and sin of homosexuality, again, that's not what I experienced. I was disfellowship, but for very different, much more mundane reasons, nothing to do with my sexuality. And so for me, it was just a way of being able to sort of, I guess, create options for Jesse and show his response to the world events going on, but also, you know, it's a touch point for all of us. We all know who we were with, what we were doing on the day of 9/11. Like, we all, you know, if we're old enough to have that memory, we all know that. So it's kind of a moment where we can all empathize with Jesse. And when Jesse is such a kind of intersectional character who is very different from, you know, most people you read in fiction, sometimes it's important to have those touch points so that we have an understanding and can empathize. And so it was the same with Brexit. The original draft that I handed into my publisher ended with the day after Christmas Day 2002. And my publisher was just like, you can't end it like that. You know, we need to see what happens. You know, you can't just leave Jesse. You know, we read so many of these queer stories that end in tragedy. So like, let's see him grow up. And so I thought to move the story along to the summer of 2016, because that was really the time in which I became much more aware of what my experience as a Black man in this country means, the powerlessness, the voicelessness, the increase in racial abuses and racial assaults against Black and brown people in this country that Brexit and the Leave vote empowered racists and fascists to perpetrate. I just wanted to show what it's like to be a young Black queer person at that time. And so it felt fitting to sort of move the story along. And then, of course, we're still all of us in Europe, not just in Britain, everywhere in Europe, living with the consequences of Brexit. And so that's why it was important for me to write that section in first person, not in first person, sorry, in present tense, because it's what we're still going through. It's still history being lived and experienced by all of us. And for the record, I voted to remain. I love Europe, I love
Non avevamo dubbi.
European.
Well, we didn't have any doubts about it.
Non avevamo dubbi. A questo proposito mi viene subito da dirti che non vediamo l'ora di averti qua a Milano.
Would you like to say that we can't wait for you to come to Milan, and would you like to show you around?
Perché sarebbe un grande onore.
It would be a great honor for
so
us
che sei
to
stato in
have you
Grecia di
here.
recente, ma ti aspettiamo. Vado veloce e ti fa la domanda Alessandro.
Well, I've been to Milan once. I was there for about an hour. I was on my way to Sardinia and had to switch flights, but we had like an hour in Milan, and I came to McDonald's. You guys have like lobster sandwiches in Italy at McDonald's. I mean, that's amazing. I don't know if it's the same now, but anyway.
Ah, non lo sapevo. Beh, dai, ti porteremo, ti faremo anche quando verrai a assaggiare qualche piatto italiano.
Take you there, and maybe we'll have you taste some Italian dishes, and you'll be our guest, of course.
Paul, ci sono ancora alcune domande. Non so
we still have some questions. I don't know if you have to leave. If you have some time.
Ok. Grazie mille. Allora, c'è la domanda di Alessandro, a cui questo libro, come a tutti noi, è piaciuto tantissimo, che ha ad oggetto il tema dell'evoluzione, della modificazione del razzismo nel corso del tempo, delle epoche storiche. Alessandro.
Ciao Paul, grazie.
Hello Paul, thank you.
Sì, io sono portavoce della riflessione del gruppo rispetto al razzismo.
I'll be the spokesperson about our reflections on racism, which is, of course, one of the key things in the novel.
Evidente le risposte a praticamente tutte le domande che hai dato finora.
From all your answers,
in parte l'hai già risposta. Noi ci siamo chiesti quali fossero i modelli a cui hai attinto per narrare l'evoluzione del razzismo attraverso le generazioni dei personaggi della storia, e ci hai raccontato che hai attinto molto dalla storia della tua famiglia. Questa è una cosa che è evidente, ma che ci ha raccontato molto bene anche stasera. E legandoci un po' alla risposta che hai dato alla domanda precedente, forse ci puoi dire qualcosa di più su come si è evoluta l'esperienza del razzismo invece negli ultimi anni, quali sono le prospettive rispetto a un possibile futuro nella vita di Jessie, quindi insomma dopo la fine del romanzo, se l'esperienza del razzismo che hanno avuto tutte le generazioni prima di lui te nella tua famiglia,
and in your family,
come pensi si possano invece evolvere nel futuro? Vediamo se riusciamo a coltivare un po' di speranza insieme.
And if we're able to, grow some hope together.
Thank you for your question, Alessandro. Well, I'm just very interested in the differences between the generations, and that's kind of what I've tried to put across. If I had more time with the novel, I had to hand in. I was late. I had to hand in, and there was a whole section that I wanted to write in full, and that was the character of Robert, who is Jessie's father and Norman's son. And so, as I said earlier, the shape of the novel became how these two characters form in their own way the lost generation. And I thought it was quite poignant that he was the lost generation because he died of AIDS and his father died when he was 2 years old. And so there's this kind of sense of broken lineage, but still a sense of survival, because Jessie does get to the age where he thinks, hold on a minute, I have a past and I have a history. I guess, one of the most insidious things about racism is that it teaches people of color that we don't belong and that we don't have a history. I got to the age of 31, 32 before I realized that I was a descendant of slaves. And that is a very strange thing to say, because I think everyone is much better educated now about this kind of thing. But it was only really 7 or 8 years ago for me that I realized that. I was never empowered to think. I didn't have the time to stop and think because I had so many other things to deal with. Like, I grew up in poverty. I grew up with this religious doctrine that sort of completely encapsulated, or, completely sort of encapsulated my identity. And then, spent 15 years trying to sort of break free from that. And so I just had all of this going on in my head, and then you realize that you're dealing with the fact that you haven't been educated about your own history and that it's up to you to do that, and that you've only been taught a sort of mainstream history that that is basically only about white people, and that you have to identify with that, or, you know, you're outside the capitalist vehicle. So, you know, I'm one of the lucky ones because I've realized that, and I've started to educate myself, you know, and yes, through looking back at my family history, but also through reading, you know. One thing I realized recently, so I was asked to review the Cambridge history of Black and Asian British writing for the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, which is a huge job, and I don't know why I agreed to do it. But it made me realize one thing in particular, which was that between 1948 and 1971, which is what we call the Windrush generation, there were over 70 novels by Black British authors, by Caribbean British authors published. And I couldn't even name 5. And I wrote my whole novel having read those 5 novels thinking, oh, well, that's all the history we have then. But over 70, and I couldn't believe it. And, you know, I'm starting to rediscover some of those novels for myself now, and they're all brilliant. So I'm just like, well, you know, what's happened? Why was I being taught Thomas Hardy and J.B. Priestley and, you know, all these other dead white authors at school? Because that's what you're taught literature is. English literature is these dead white men. I wasn't even taught any women, you know? It would have been so much better for me to be studying Sam Selvon, Andrea Levy, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Carol Phillips, Linton Kwesi Johnson, you know, people who, my story and my history and the history of Black British life is alive in me. It was alive in them as generations who came before me, you know, so I would have just learned so much more about myself and about my place in the world as a Black man, had I been introduced to that work and had it not been hidden from me. And I think what our task is, as this generation and the future generations, is to always keep that work alive in academia, but also on bookshelves and accessible for the future generations so that they can see themselves, you know, they can see that they have a history and that it's not just them going through the same thing as the previous generation did without knowing, you know, because that's what causes so many problems. People being lost, people not having any frames of reference, not having any role models, not believing that there are people out there who have thought like them, experienced like them, solved problems like them, you know, and having to do it again and again and again, each generation anew. You know, we are a community, we have a history that is a timeline, and it just keeps being broken, and we have to stop that. And so I haven't quite gone into it in the novel, but I feel like what readers should take away from the ending of the book is that Jesse, as the 3rd generation, is in a position to reflect back on the previous generations and tell the stories that they weren't able to. Yeah, to be in charge of our historiography. And coming back to this Cambridge history of Black and Asian British writing, which was 700 pages long and 42 essays about Black and Asian British writing, only 2 of the contributors were of African and Caribbean heritage. And there were 12 Asian writers, and the rest were all white people from Italy and Belgium and Luxembourg, Australia, Canada. And I'm like, great, like, you're experts in your field, but this isn't good enough in 2020. At least half of those contributors, if this is about Black and Asian British history, at least half of those contributors should have been Black. And the sad thing is, we do have a terrible lack of Black British literary scholars. In fact, there are only 5 doing PhDs currently in Britain. So I'm enrolled on a course at Goldsmiths in Black British literature. And the co-founder of that course, a Black woman called Joan Animado, of Guyanese heritage, she became the first Black female literature professor in Britain in 1994. And she retired last year, still as the only Black female literature professor in the country. So that just goes to show there's no handover, there's no, people, and I'm not even going to go into Goldsmith's role in that because I'll probably get sued. But it's damning. It's really damning, and it's a slap in the face to us as Black British people, because it just shows us that our history and our role in the history doesn't matter, when in fact we've made a huge contribution to this country politically, culturally, in terms of Caribbean soldiers coming to fight for Britain during World War II and World War I. We've been doing this for a long time. We've been contributing for a long time to British life, and yet we don't have a voice, and our history keeps being broken. That has to change. And so I am a member of the Black Writers Guild that was started last year. Over 300 Black British writers, editors, publishers all came together to form this guild to hold the publishing industry to account for lack of diversity, lack of attention paid to backlists, only sort of coming through with a few Black British authors every few years. That all has to stop, because the writers are there, they need to be nurtured. I'm one of those writers who came through and got nurtured by my publisher, So it just goes to show what can happen if you just sort of put a little bit of effort in. That's all it is. And as a guild, it's our responsibility to make sure that the cycle doesn't keep being broken, that we can move forward and keep growing. And also, once we've held the publishing industry to account, then we hope to be able to hold the whole country to account, really, in terms of just changing the way things are done and changing the way Black people in particular are treated in this country. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, Paul, volevo dirti una cosa che mi fa piacere dirti, nel senso che noi come gruppo di lettura LGBT quest'anno abbiamo letto Amatissima di Toni Morrison, tradotto da una importante traduttrice che tra l'altro è qui stasera, che si chiama Chiara Scalino, che è venuta a sentirti e che ha curato delle pubblicazioni di Toni Morrison, è una grande esperta. Abbiamo letto Ragazza, Donna, di Bernardini Evaristo, e abbiamo letto sempre quest'anno anche La stanza di Giovanni, e tutti questi tre libri, noi leggiamo un libro all'anno, hanno qualcosa, il tuo libro è come se in qualche modo avesse un fil rouge, un tratto comune con questi libri. Amatissima c'è la schiavitù, Ragazza, Donna, Altro, ci sono tanti temi oltre al razzismo, ma anche per esempio il teatro, no? Tra l'altro l'hai visto tu la menzione nel romanzo, lei ha vinto il Booker Prize, e in questo senso forse è stato importante the Booker Prize, and for her that prize must have been very important also to deliver society from this perspective towards Black authors. So what we can say through this answer you gave us tonight is that we will try to bring, to promote your book in Italy, because we really loved it, and we're going to spread it all over the country, because we care about it, and we really want to for it to be appreciated in Italy, not only in the United States or United Kingdom. And moving over to the next question, we're going to skip a couple of them because apparently we won't have time, but if you do have some more time, we have one question from Viviana.
Ciao Paul, la mia domanda riguarda il rapporto tra desiderio sessuale e una sorta di, possiamo chiamarla, fallimento dell'etica. A un certo punto del romanzo Jesse si rende conto di desiderare sessualmente uomini bianchi e c'è una riflessione che mi ha colpito molto in cui scrivi Dio è un uomo bianco e i bianchi sono quindi l'incarnazione terrena di Dio ed è per questo che Jesse è attratto dagli uomini bianchi ed è lo stesso motivo per il quale appunto odia se stesso in quanto nero. Tuttavia gli uomini bianchi rappresentano comunque il simbolo un po', possiamo dire, dell'oppressione in senso razziale. E quindi poi ovviamente Jesse ha poi la sua storia con Owen, che è comunque un uomo bianco, borghese, uno studente universitario, e quindi ci si chiedeva insomma con riflessione se il desiderio sessuale e sentimentale in qualche modo può far fallire l'etica e in che termini, insomma, così, una domanda aperta.
Thank you, Viviana. That's a very good question. One that I'm probably not going to be able to answer. I don't think there's any point trying to explain taste and why people do what they do or sort of dig too deep. I mean, we just sort of go for the people that we go for. I do want to say as well that Owen is a completely fictional character. There was no Owen in my experience, and I totally wish there was, but because he's lovely, but he's someone I created. Yeah, I don't know. I think there is something to be said for the fact that the whole concept of sexual desire is something that's rooted in white patriarchy. You know, everything that we see is sort of calculated for that gaze. And you kind of grow up with that. You kind of grow up thinking that you have to sort of ingratiate yourself to white men in order to sort of get by in the world. And because Jesse comes upon sex as a way to promote himself and to survive, that simply becomes his reason to be. And just to sort of say as well, I'm currently reading Ceremonies, which is a book by Essex Hemphill, the African-American poet, essayist and activist who died of AIDS-related complications in 1995. This was a book of prose and poetry that came out in 1992. And there's an essay in it called Ceremonies, in which he talks about being a 14-year-old Black boy in the ghetto in New York. Was it New York? No, DC. Can't remember. DC, I think. And his first, or the person who sort of initiated him into gay sex was a white man called George, who was 30 years older than him. And it was just the first time I'd ever seen somewhere else sex between a teenage Black boy and a middle-aged white man put somewhere else, other than my novel. So again, sort of touching back on this sort of idea that we have no history and that we have to experience everything ourselves without knowing what came before. I wish someone had pushed this book into my hand when I was 19 years old. But this man, George, was, I think, seducing all of the Black teenage boys in the area, and Essex, 14-year-old Essex, was simply the one who stuck, and they sort of had sex all through that summer. But there was a lot of homophobia, despite the fact all of the other Black boys in the neighborhood had slept with this guy. There was a lot of homophobia amongst them, and they couldn't talk about it themselves. So in terms of being a young, queer Black man at the turn of the millennium, who still feels that the Black community is intrinsically homophobic, white men are the only way he's going to have sex, in a way. Because for him, with his internalized homophobia, he's kind of thinking, well, if I approach another black guy, I don't know how that's going to go down. And also the gay community is majority white. When you go to a gay club in the West Midlands in 2000, 2002, 2004, it's going to be mostly white men on the dance floor. And they'll be looking at you, you'll be looking at them, because that's all there is to look at. And so it sort of happens that way, which is why black on black love is seen as such a radical act of self-love. And that's not something that Jessie experiences in the book, but that's something I hope to write about at another time.
Grazie Paul. Fondiamo due domande in una, perché c'era una domanda che riguardava la ricerca, il tema della ricerca delle proprie origini nel tuo libro, che è molto interessante, si chiude un po' con la ricerca di questo padre che Jessie non ha avuto e che comunque è uno spettro che aleggia in tutto il romanzo si conclude con appunto il padre era un pittore, Jessie trova un quadro e l'importanza di quanto sia fondamentale per chi non ha conosciuto le proprie origini trovarle in qualche modo e trovare quello che ci eravamo domandati e su cui avevamo riflettuto nel corso del nostro dibattito è su quanto sia fondamentale, sempre fondamentale trovare per forza il proprio padre mancato o le proprie origini. Però c'è un'altra domanda che ha a che fare sempre con la genitorialità e che te la fa Laura. Ha il tema della, non so se si può tradurre in inglese, della autogenitorialità.
Buonasera Paul.
Buonasera.
A un certo punto della narrazione Jessie vorrebbe dare a se stesso giovane consigli su come proteggersi di più o fare scelte migliori per se stesso. E ho avuto l'impressione che da quel momento in avanti l'autonomia di Jessie aumentasse e questa mia ipotesi si legherebbe un po' a una delle ultime frasi del libro e alla consapevolezza che i genitori non ci sarebbero più stati. Le chiedo se pensa che diventiamo maturi e indipendenti solo quando riusciamo a guardare noi stessi da una prospettiva genitoriale. Grazie.
Thank you.
I don't want to make everything about the family and about parents' role. I think it's inevitable that we grow up and become more mature and we see we find other role models and we find other sort of reflections of ourselves. You know, Jessie's parents don't accept him for who he is at any point. And even when he's older and he calls the family home, it's kind of over. So, you know, he's not, that's where at the end of the novel, I was fully planning for Jessie to go to his parents' house and confront them. But I decided not to do that because I didn't want to ruin it. You know, Jessie sort of comes to a place where he realizes that he's got everything that he wants. And, you know, and that doesn't include his parents, and that's acceptable. You know, it's not harming him anymore because he's got love and he's got a job and he's got friends and he's got a flat and everything's great. And, you know, he's got his father, whom he discovers as this painter. And so there's this whole kind of world that he just wasn't aware of that he's really looking forward to exploring. And at that age, Jessie is sort of in his mid-30s. So he's not that much younger than his mother was when Jesse was disfellowshipped. And he must look at the difference between them and think, I'm doing okay. So there's no longer any reason for him to worry about. They've got God. They've chosen God over him. They've got God. They've got their religion. And he's got himself. And he's fine with that.
Grazie Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul.
La penultima domanda rapida le unifichiamo, nel senso che sono due domande che hanno a che fare con la musica. Noi abbiamo adorato la musica del libro e l'abbiamo anche ascoltata. Tu non sai che noi a volte creiamo anche delle playlist nel gruppo di lettura sui libri che leggiamo. Ad esempio c'è la nostra playlist della stanza di Giovanni, c'è la nostra playlist di Amatissima e ovviamente abbiamo ascoltato la playlist del romanzo. Quindi faccio fare la domanda prima a Siria e poi a Clara, la tua traduttrice, perché sono molto simili e hanno tutte e due queste domande a che fare con la musica. Prima Siria e poi Clara.
Ciao Paul, la musica è una grande protagonista del tuo romanzo e rappresenta anche uno dei pochi contatti o punti di legame tra Jess e la mamma. Come mai hai voluto dare così tanto spazio a questa forma di espressione? Grazie.
E poi Clara, tra l'altro Paul, consentimi di dire che Clara ha fatto un lavoro davvero eccezionale, nel senso che è riuscita a, soprattutto anche nella prima parte, ci sono dei termini che usano che vengono usati nel linguaggio che userebbe Norman, insomma, tipo adesso metterò in crisi il traduttore simultaneo che ti sta parlando, dico in italiano, probabilmente non saprà dirvi, però ad esempio smarmellato o snumerato, di queste parole che la tua traduttrice è riuscita a rendere in italiano e che anche chi ha confrontato poi i testi ha detto è stata molto brava, perché lei ha anche molto amato il tuo libro e ci ha mandato anche degli audio, non poteva venire qua perché lei sta nel sud dell'Italia, però quando abbiamo discusso il libro lei ci ha mandato questi bellissimi audio in cui rifletteva sul tuo romanzo. Sei stato molto fortunato. Clara,
lucky to have her as a translator. So Clara, the floor is yours.
Clara, devi attivare il microfono.
So Clara, I
devi
think you
attivare il
have
microfono.
to turn on your microphone first.
Fatto.
Okay.
Ciao
Okay,
Paul.
done.
Ciao.
Hello Paul.
Ciao.
Per me è stato un onore, un
It was
piacere
a real honor and pleasure
gioia
for me to translate your novel, to translate
mi hai
you.
spinto oltre
You
tutti i miei
pushed
limiti
myself beyond all of my limits.
e dal punto di vista linguistico è stata una
And
bellissima
from the
esperienza
linguistic point of view, it was an amazing experience.
e anche dal punto di vista umano ti ho
But
sentito
also
così
from the
vicino a
human
me, questa è
point of
forse
view.
proprio la
I
forza
always
della
felt
traduzione
you beside me, and maybe this is the strength of translation.
e anche proprio l'incontro, insomma,
And
di due persone.
the meeting of two people, it felt as if I were meeting you.
Io mentre traducevo ascoltavo
So as
tutta
I
la
was
musica che
translating, I
ascoltava
always
Jessie
listened to the music Jessie listened to in the book.
e volevo chiederti semplicemente una
I just
cosa, non
wanted to
voglio
ask you one
rubarti
very
molto
simple thing. I
tempo.
don't want to take too much of your time.
Quando scrivi, ascolti sempre
So when
musica?
you write, do you always listen to music?
First of all, it's very nice to meet you, Clara.
Grazie.
Thank you so much for Latte Arcobaleno.
Prego.
And yeah, I'm just very impressed because, there are so many different voices and accents and phonetically rendered speech, etc. in the book. So it must have been an absolute nightmare for you. So thank you so much for your patience and for delivering a beautiful book. Thank you. It's a wonderful pleasure to see you this evening.
Grazie a te.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you.
So in terms of the music, I'll answer your question actually first, Clara. So I have different sort of stages of work. There are some moments that require absolute silence. such as when I'm actually sort of producing the text in the first place. But when I'm doing all of the research, and then again, when I'm editing, so the first and third phases, I tend to listen to music. Okay. Because I live in a very sort of beautiful part of London, but it's very noisy. So there's a big ancient park behind our house. And it's one of the biggest parks in London. It's called Hampstead Heath, if anyone knows.
I conosco.
Right.
Yes, I do know it.
Yeah, good. So sometimes it's like a theme park or a music festival or something like that. You know, it's just incredibly noisy, dogs barking, children screaming. There's a sports ground there. You know, people sort of DJing, having parties, etc., etc. And then the street I live in is, it's all Victorian houses, so late 19th century houses, and they're always being done up. There's always scaffolding going up, and there's always roadworks being done. So it's an incredibly noisy environment, which for a writer is just like scream worthy. So I tend to sort of curate playlists in which I have music that's familiar to me, that won't challenge me, but music that also stimulates me in a way. Mm-hmm. It's quite a sort of tight balance between the two. So I'm able to concentrate, but I'm also sort of blocking out external sound and just creating an environment for myself to work in. And that's what I use while researching and editing. And I find that I can get hours and hours and hours of work done, and it's a joy to do. And also, because I'm listening to this very familiar music, familiar but not intrusive, some of that, I don't know, that there were just some like really interesting parallels with the material that I was working with. And so some of the lyrics did bleed through. And I was listening to Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures while I was writing the Christmas Day scene, and it just sort of seemed to fit perfectly. Certainly in terms of Owen being the sort of person who would have listened to Joy Division when they weren't trendy anymore. And Jesse sort of being introduced to music that is produced with a particular sound that reminds him of home. And so it's his first reckoning with nostalgia only a few months after he's left. It's his first sort of access to being able to miss home and think about what he's lost. So again, it's sort of, you know, from two very different angles, Jesse and Owen can come together and have this shared experience. I didn't plan to use music in such a way. To come to Syria, your question. First of all, let me just say, my phone just thought I said, "Hey Siri." Sorry. Yeah, I didn't plan to use music in such a way. But again, just sort of realizing that music is so universal and so much a part of our shared experience. So the scene with Rufus, for example, who Jesse meets at the Coleherne nightclub and then goes back to his place and they listen to 80s R&B. That's the sort of stuff that Jesse's mother was playing during his childhood. But it's also the sort of thing that Rufus was dancing to in nightclubs as a young man. So it's two very, very different worlds colliding through this kind of shared thread. And the other thing that I'll say about that is I was challenged to write a novel. So I handed in what was ostensibly a memoir to my publisher, and she said, "I want you to write a novel. I need you to move away from yourself. I need you to..." She could tell that I was holding back because I was maybe talking about my mother and not willing to go too far and betray my mother in that way. Or there were certain things that I wasn't able to talk about in terms of reopening old wounds. So she challenged me to write a novel. And that's not something that you can just do like that. It's a craft that you have to learn. And so I threw absolutely everything that I could think of at this novel in order to generate material. And one of the ways that I struck upon early on to both generate or excavate memories and also generate new material was to listen to music, because it always puts me in a space, it always puts me in a particular mood, puts me in an aesthetic space, and it puts me in a time frame. And that was how I was able to generate material in the first instance. So, or at least one of the ways. So I could have taken it all out at the end and sort of made it all look seamless. But I wanted to honor the musicians involved. I wanted to honor the songs involved. And I also wanted the reader to have those little moments of shared experience. We all remember songs like Love Will Tear Us Apart. We all remember songs like When I Think of You by Janet Jackson. You know, they're universal songs. And, you know, like what I was saying about 9/11 earlier, they're moments for us to have a shared empathy. We all bring, because every reader brings themselves to every novel that they read. And the more we can recognize ourselves in that novel, hopefully the greater empathy we can have for the voice in the book. So it was kind of an accident, I suppose, but I guess a happy one if you enjoyed it.
Grazie Paul, ti faccio io l'ultimissima domanda,
I'm going to ask the last question for tonight. It really is the last one, and it's about style and structure of the novel. We talked about the themes, and now we're going to talk about style and structure. So I find
stile del libro, l'uso del linguaggio, ben
the
tradotto,
use of
come
language
dicevamo
and the
prima, e la
style of the book really
struttura.
masterful,
Ad esempio,
as
ti
well as
faccio
its
un esempio,
structure.
la prima parte
For
ambientata
example,
tra la Giamaica e la Black Country,
set
e
in
poi
Jamaica,
la
between
seconda
Jamaica
parte
and the
che è
Black
più recente
Country,
nel tempo.
and the second part,
Ed
which is
esistono
more
delle
related to present
parti in
day.
cui il
And there
tempo
are some
sembra quasi
parts in the
allungarsi,
novel where
cioè ad
time
esempio
feels
la
like
notte
it
di
is
Natale tra
diluted. For
Jessie ed
example,
Owen, che
Christmas
invade una
night
buona
between
parte
Jessie and
del libro, che ho
Owen
trovato
overtakes,
meravigliosa, e
a
delle
good
parti
part of the
più
novel,
rapide.
which I
E io ho trovato,
found really
anch'io sono uno
amazing, and some of the
scrittore,
parts
ho
sort of,
trovato questa
a little bit quicker.
struttura e
And as a
questo
reader, found
stile
this
che potrebbe
this
essere
writing
considerato
and
forse un
this
po'
style,
grezzo,
which could be
ma
considered
molto
maybe a little
molto
bit as
bello, molto
rough, but
prezioso,
really
in quanto
beautiful,
molto
really
libero,
precious, because it is
da vincoli
really
che spesso
free
vengono
from,
imposti, cioè spesso le
some
scuole
kind
di
of
scrittura, secondo me,
bonds that are
danno delle regole
imposed
su come
on
deve
the
essere
writer,
strutturato in
by
maniera
writing schools.
molto, ad esempio, americana, no?
Writes
Il
taught
romanzo,
how
mentre
text
il
should be
tuo libro
structured in
ha
an
questa
American way,
struttura, ha questo
but
linguaggio
your book,
che
on the other hand,
ho
has this
trovato
structure,
meraviglioso,
this
e quello che mi
language
sento di
that I
dirti,
found
non
really
oserei mai
amazing. And
darti un
what I would
consiglio
like to
perché
say,
sei un
well,
autore
of
molto
course,
più bravo di me,
I would
molto più
never
importante, però
try to
di
give
non
you any
perdere
advice because you're a great writer, but
grandissima
never lose
come dire,
this
capacità e
great
questo
ability of
dono che hai
yours,
avuto nel rendere
this
questo
gift you
libro e
had
strutturarlo
to
in questo
structure
modo.
this book
Quello che a
as it
questo
is.
punto volevo dirti,
And
dopo
what
questa
I
premessa,
want to
è
ask you in the end of this long
appunto
introduction
se
is that
qual è stato l'editing che
so
hai
what
fatto
was
su
the
questo
editing process
romanzo,
you
e
had
se sei stato
you did
influenzato
on this
dai
novel,
tuoi
and were you
editor, o se
influenced
hai
by your
voluto
editors, or
conservare
did
la
you actually
tua
want to
originalità, la tua identità,
preserve your
e ti sei sentito invece
originality,
molto
your
libero.
identity,
E
or did
quindi
you
volevo
feel
sapere, appunto,
free
conoscere
from
come hai
any
lavorato
bond? So
sul
I just
romanzo.
wanted to know how you worked on it.
First of all, thank you, Giacomo, for those very kind words. You got me welling up a little bit, so that's very sweet. Thank you. Like I said in the previous answer, I have no craft of my own, and there are so few precursors to work like mine that I knew of at the time. So I just had to do what I wanted and just trust myself. And there are always kind of things to sort of books to sort of keep nearby, so to speak. So in terms of the episodic structure, when I say episodic, I mean sections that are sort of spaced apart with time in between, and no real sense of reflection between each. The Spa Shelter Fair by Alan Hollinghurst influenced that. So that novel is set, it takes place in sort of 5 or 6 sections between 1940 and 2015. And you just sort of introduced at the start of each section to a time in this protagonist's life, and you're just with him, and you just have to accept that time has passed. You don't get a summary, and you just get immersed into where his life is now, and you kind of make the decision yourself as the reader, what may or may not have happened in between. And I just thought, because, you know, you're supposed to show and not tell, that it would be a good way to show Jesse's life, just where he is at that moment and what's surrounding him, what his mental and emotional state is, what the events are, and then move on and hopefully see him at a different sort of phase. So in terms of the language, at the time I was reading A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin, and White Teeth by Zadie Smith, and Small Island by Andrew Levy. Did I say that already? No. All of which sort of straddle the line between Jamaican patois and sort of standard English. And so I was empowered reading those books to use authentic voices. I'm not sure if it came through in the translation that there is a young Italian character in the restaurant called Patrizia. And she kind of has her very own way of speaking. There's another Italian character later on in the book called Melania, who also has a very particular way of speaking that I wanted to sort of conserve this kind of Italian English, where everyone's called babes and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So just sort of capturing people's voices, I think that sort of tells the story by itself, because you, as a reader, you kind of know where they're from and you maybe know people like them. So yeah, it was an interesting sort of process there. But I've kind of alluded to the fact that Rainbow Milk went through several different iterations. And as you know, I live with Alan Hollinghurst, my partner, who is a very, very astute editor. And there were a couple of drafts that I came up with that we sat down to go over his notes, and I couldn't see my text because it was just so covered in his scribbles and his queries and questions. And when there were too many notes, I tended to just tear the whole thing up and start again, because it just, you know, it just meant that I had to sort of get to know my material a little bit better and not rush. And I also said earlier that until very late on in the process, Rainbow Milk was in first person, and ended just after the Christmas Day scene. So I handed that in January 2019. 3 days later, I retracted it from my publisher and said, look, I'm really sorry, but this has to be in third person. I have to try that as part of my process. So I did. Produced another 64,000 word manuscript that was basically all new material, but in third person within 2 months. And then it was a back and forth between myself and my editor in terms of growing the text. And then including, almost at the last minute, Norman's section, which was written much earlier on. It was written in 2018. And wasn't intended to be part of Rainbow Milk. But then I realized at the end that Norman is Jess's grandfather. And again, in terms of framing the story to tell the Lost Generation story in the middle, it became vital for me to use that. So it was all pretty much accidental in terms of the finished product. And I'm just really glad that I had people around me who weren't just sort of accepting what I was writing, and that really sort of took me to task over it, really helped me to grow as a writer. Like I said, I've never written fiction before writing Rainbow Milk, and I did it in 2 years. or less than 2 years. So yeah, it was kind of ruthless at times in terms of the editing, but I'm glad I went through all of that. And now I do feel like I have a craft, and I'm already starting to think about my second novel, and it's going to be very different in terms of the way I treat the material and produce the material.
Guarda, è stato fatto un lavoro molto bello, perché comunque l'impressione che se ne è avuta è che sia un libro appunto nella struttura, diciamo, non canonico, ma proprio questa è la cosa più bella, diciamo, che abbiamo più amato, come dicevo prima, il passaggio tra le varie epoche, la struttura della prima parte, il tempo, la notte di Natale noi l'abbiamo amata moltissimo, insomma, quindi davvero davvero complimenti. A questo punto direi che ci possiamo salutare e noi ti ringraziamo tantissimo. Ti chiediamo se hai voglia di, in futuro, se avrai modo di segnalarci alcuni dei libri che cominciano ad essere pubblicati a cui facevi riferimento, di autori appunto che di colore, che comunque pensi che debbano essere letti anche in Italia. Tra l'altro i nostri interpreti sono anche due bravissimi traduttori, anche loro, e ti invitiamo a Milano quando vorrai, perché magari andiamo al McDonald's insieme o in pizzeria o dove vorrai, e ci saremo tutti di sicuro, perché abbiamo amato Jessie e abbiamo amato te, e ti ringraziamo per questo libro, lo promuoveremo in lungo, in largo in Italia, e speriamo che venga in tutto il mondo, e quindi grazie di cuore.
Thank you. I didn't quite answer your question previously properly. So the Christmas Day scene, just very briefly, I'm an emotional person. I'm an emotionally led person rather than an intellectual person. And so for me, when I was writing that scene, that was just me sort of enjoying the book. That was the scene that I enjoyed writing the most. And the one that I kept editing and writing more and more and more, because I was just enjoying it. And I was, it's the scene where Jessie falls in love, and I'm a romantic person. I'm sorry, I'm an emotional person, and so it's interesting that that's pretty much the scene that people love the most in the book, because it's the one that I loved writing the most. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important to have joy when you're writing, because that's what translates over to the reader. So thank you so much, all of you, for attending this evening. It's wonderful to see all of your faces and to hear all of your comments, and all of your questions have been so deep and meaningful. And I'm just sort of very impressed with myself that I've created something that has touched you in that way. So thank you. I will, when I'm next in Italy, I'll definitely come and visit you in Milan.
Assolutamente.
Absolutely.
Mi dimenticavo anche di ringraziare gli interpreti che
thank the
hanno interpretato
interpreters
questa serata. Sono due membri del gruppo di lettura, nel senso che anche loro hanno letto il libro, l'hanno anche loro molto amato, e che ci hanno consentito di parlare come se parlassimo la stessa lingua. Quindi grazie a Nino, che è la persona che ci sta parlando in questo momento, e grazie a Massimiliano, che è la persona che ti ha dato una voce diciamo orale. Grazie mille soprattutto a te, Paul, grazie a Clara, la traduttrice, e grazie soprattutto a tutti i membri del gruppo di lettura LGBT, perché sono davvero, tu non li conosci, Paul, ma posso assicurarti che sono delle persone meravigliose tutte quante. Ti aspettiamo a Milano, ciao.
So we're waiting for you in Milan. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, grazie, ciao.
Thank you guys, goodbye.
Ciao.
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 Ok.
Ciao, grazie.
Grazie a te, Clara. Nino, forse puoi interrompere la registrazione.